Hi there. Thanks everyone for coming today, and thank you to those of you who joined online. I'm Liz Rose. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Florida, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about my dissertation research today that looks at burrowing owls in both urban and rural habitats in Florida, but with a little extra emphasis on the ranch owls. And so I want to start with my acknowledgments, so I have time. And first, I'd like to thank my advisor and my lab here, Dr. Raoul Boughton at the Range Cattle REC. And I am also a student at UF in the Department of Wildlife, Ecology, and Conservation, and the School of Natural Resources and Environment there. And I also have to thank Allie Smith, who's a master's student in our lab. She's not here, but she helped collect a lot of the data that I'll be talking about today. And I've received financial support from a lot of places, and this includes the University of Florida, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, Cape Coral Friends of Wildlife, as well as Audubon of the Western Everglades. And to do this research, I relied on countless volunteers that are too numerous to list here, but thank you to all of them for their time and efforts in supporting my research. And of course, none of this would be possible at all without the private ranchers and landowners and managers that let me access their properties over several years. And before I start, actually, I want to point out that I will have plenty of time at the end for questions, both in person and if you're online, you can type your questions in and I'll try to get to all of them at the end. So my research, of course, focuses on the Florida burrowing owl, Athenia canicularia floridana. And to start, I'm just going to give a little bit of general information about this species, especially in Florida. And so they're small diurnal birds of prey that are active both at day and night. And they're small, they weigh only about 6 ounces each, which is about the size of a Florida navel orange. But they pack a punch in that small size. And of course, the use of burrows, it's what makes them unique and of course gives them their name. And so burrowing owls have their nests, lay their eggs, and seek shelter in burrows underground. And in Florida, the subspecies that we have here is actually able to dig their own burrows. And these burrows can be up to 12 feet long, but most of the ones that we've measured are more like 5 or 7 feet long, and they could be up to 1 meter or 3 feet underground. And these burrows typically consist of a long tunnel, and right before the end, they take a sharp curve into a nest chamber where the females will lay and incubate the eggs and then brood the young. So most of their early reproduction takes place underground and out of sight. And at the start of the nesting season, male burrowing owls do something pretty interesting. They actually decorate the entrances of their burrows. And so when you start seeing objects on the splay of sand that surrounds the entrance, that's a good sign that breeding is about to start. And so this male here, you can see he used a lot of natural materials. There's some coconut husks and sticks, but we find all sorts of interesting objects. In urban sites, I find everything from cigarette butts to children's homework that's been crumpled up and torn up and stolen. And on ranches, I find a lot of interesting natural objects like moth wings, feathers, skeletons, and anything shiny or interesting like shells or beetle carapaces. And so once the nesting season begins, the females will be spending most of their time underground, laying eggs, incubating them, and then brooding the young until they're about 2 weeks old. And that egg incubation period lasts for about 4 weeks. And after the owlets hatch, when they're about 2 weeks old, they'll start venturing out to the entrance of their burrow. And when they're around 3 to 4 weeks old, like these juveniles are here, they're constantly outside running around, causing trouble and harassing their parents for food. And these juvenile owls, by the time they're 6 weeks old, are now proficient flyers and are learning to hunt on their own, but they'll typically stay around their nest burrow and with their parents until they're about 3 months old. At that point, they'll typically start venturing out on their own, potentially to look for their own territory and burrow site. And so burrowing owls don't just live in Florida. There's multiple subspecies, up to a dozen, that are spread out all across North and South America, from Canada to the tip of South America. So in North America, we have 2 subspecies. There's the Western burrowing owl, whose breeding range is shown in the purple and I guess peach color here. And this subspecies actually has two kinds of populations. The one are migratory populations, especially those that breed up north, and those migrate south to Mexico in the winter. And they also have resident populations in this purple area. where the owls live and breed year-round. Well, they live year-round, they don't breed year-round. And over in Florida, we have, of course, the Florida subspecies. And this subspecies is found, of course, in Florida, but also in parts of the Caribbean. And our Florida burrowing owls don't migrate, and they stay here year-round. And so burrowing owls overall are considered to be generalists in a lot of ways. They can adapt to a lot of different habitats, a lot of different food sources. But overall, one thing that they definitely need is open space. And in Florida, that usually means grasslands. For example, they won't nest in heavy scrub or forests. And so historically, they lived in areas of dry prairie habitat across the state. However, of course, most of that habitat has been lost. And so it's been replaced by land uses like agriculture and urban development. And so luckily, burrowing owls have been able to adapt to living on some of these altered landscapes. And now we find a lot of burrowing owls on places like cattle ranches that have improved pastures. And so a lot of these landscapes are planted, as you know, with mixtures of non-native grasses, and the grass is kept short by cattle grazing. And this creates a nice open shortgrass habitat that burrowing owls prefer. And so burrowing owls have also colonized urban areas of the state in areas where they weren't found historically. So as coastal areas, especially in southern Florida, were cleared and drained for development, this created this nice high, dry ground that burrowing owls like to nest on. And so burrowing owls colonized these new urban areas, and now we have large populations, especially in South Florida, and especially in southwestern Florida in places like Cape Coral and Marco Island. And within these areas, there's a lot of non-native vertebrates like this brown anole that burrowing owls can eat. And so along those lines, I often get asked, what do burrowing owls eat? And my answer is pretty much always whatever they can kill and carry. They're definitely what you could call an opportunist because they take advantage of whatever prey species or type is locally abundant at a given time. So for example, when you have a lot of migratory birds moving through, you'll see a lot of migratory birds at their burrows. And so I've seen everything from moths to baby turtles at burrows. And in urban areas, for example, they consume a lot of those non-native vertebrates like brown anoles, Cuban tree frogs, and Mediterranean geckos. And they also take birds and a lot of arthropod species. On ranches, they consume similar types of prey, but often different species, frogs, snakes, crayfish, and a variety of arthropods. And so past research on this subspecies in Florida has focused primarily on the urban populations, especially in Southwest Florida and in Cape Coral. There have been some studies done on rural owls and some surveys that looked for rural owls. And what they found is that most of the owls outside of cities were found on places like cattle ranches and in agricultural areas. And so what we have is a species that lives in both urban and rural habitats in Florida. But most of the data that we have on them to inform their management is actually from just urban areas. And FWC recently classified them as threatened. So understanding the whole population, not just the owls in urban areas, is increasingly important. And I think part of the problem is that it's hard to access some of these ranch owl populations because they're on large tracts of private land, whereas in urban areas, you can just drive up on the street and pull over and watch an owl at its burrow. So with our access to ranches, we were able to compare urban and rural populations extensively for the first time. And so for my dissertation, there's two general overarching objectives that I have. The first is to use burrowing owls as a means to study how animals and wildlife adapt to living in cities and with people and how this affects them. But also, I really wanted to fill in some of these knowledge gaps that we have for rural owls. And so for my project, I have study sites across Southwest Florida. I have 5 ranch sites that I visit regularly, and these are all operational cattle ranches, and 2 cities, Cape Coral and Marco Island. And so, of course, this project involved a good amount of field work. So I'm just going to briefly go over what I've been doing for the past few years. And so during the core of the study in 2017 and 2018, we monitored each ranch and city site every 7 to 10 days And when we did this, we would drive around and survey for owls. And when we found them, we would go take a GPS point of their burrow and come back and monitor it for signs of reproduction and eventually offspring. And once here I am probing a burrow to see if it has eggs or owlets in it. And once we found young, we would come back when they were about 6 weeks old to determine if this pair was successful and how many young they fledged. So we also captured and banded owls so we could follow them long term without having to recapture them. And so to do this, one of the ways we caught them was by placing a two-way walk-in trap at their burrows. And the females and juveniles would often just walk right in, but the males were a little more wary of this. And so we placed a speaker playing a territorial owl call inside that would lure them in because it simulated an intruder. And so once we captured these owls, adults got a unique combination of 3 color bands as well as a numbered metal band so that we could remotely watch them, not remotely, but from a distance watch them and determine who was who over time. We also took a very small blood sample to inform some genetic studies that we're working on. And some of these males that we captured, they had young that were less than 3 weeks old in the burrow. And with these males, some of them got GPS backpacks. And the point of these GPS backpacks was to find out where these males are going at night when they're hunting, what sort of resources they might be using, and how much space they need to raise their young successfully. And this is important to do because before the study, we had no idea how much space urban or rural owls needed or what resources they were utilizing. And so again, one of my objectives is to compare urban and rural burrowing owls. And to do this, I looked at their density, reproduction, and their space use across habitat types. And so as I mentioned, previous studies have tended to find the most burrowing owls in urban areas, especially in Southwest Florida. And while we found that they can reach really high urban densities, our results actually show that density of owls varies more among sites and within sites, example along an urbanization gradient, than it does between urban and rural habitats. So additionally, some of these ranches actually have more owls per unit area than any urban area that we studied. For example, this ranch at its peak had about 60 pairs in the small area. All these dots are individual burrows and the colors represent different owls that use them. So there are potentially a lot of burrowing owls on private lands that haven't fully been accounted for. And as far as the timing of reproduction on ranches and in cities, on average, we found that pairs on ranches tend to start laying eggs in the middle of March, and urban pairs tend to start a little bit earlier, on average about 2 weeks earlier. But again, there's a lot of variation among individuals here. And as far as reproductive success, we found across 2017 and 2018 in urban and rural sites that the urban pairs are more likely to successfully fledge juveniles than ranch pairs are, and this was consistent among years. However, if we look at the number of juveniles that each successful pair fledges, we find that when a pair is successful, there's no difference among habitat types in terms of how many young they're actually producing. So whether you're in a city or a ranch, if you're a successful pair, on average, you're going to be producing about 3 juveniles. Okay, so like I said, we put GPS on some of these males. So we also compared the movements and space use for 51 breeding males from 2 urban and 4 of our ranch sites. And these GPS units collected data overnight about every 20 minutes while the males had juveniles that were less than 5 weeks old for up to 2 weeks at a time. And this map just shows an example of this data that we collected. This is one of the ranches where I worked, and the yellow triangles represent the center of owl territories, and the individual points are GPS locations for 3 different males, each color referring to a different male. And with these data, we can look at how far the males need to go to feed their young, where they're going at night on these hunting trips potentially, the timing of these movements, so when during the night are they most active, and also the potential resources that might be driving these movements, and compare this across habitat types as well. And so what I found, first of all, is this graph shows the maximum distance from the nest that we detected each male each night. So how far each night are these males traveling away from their burrows? And the urban males are in yellow here, and the rural are in green, and they will be throughout. And first of all, we can see that some of these ranch males are going really far, farther than I expected from their nest. We had multiple males on multiple nights travel up to 5 kilometers away from their nest burrow. And overall, ranch owls tend to be moving farther away from their nests at night. And there's more variation from owl to owl than we have for urban owls, who tend to stay closer to their nests and tend to have less variation from owl to owl in these movements. And one important implication of this, especially for ranch owls, is that the entire landscape around the burrow and even around the ranch is potentially important for reproduction, because not only are these owls leaving the area around their burrows, they're often leaving ranches at night. And so if we look at when these owls are making these farthest trips away from the nest, we see this pattern here. Burrowing owls in general tend to be a crepuscular species, which means that they're most active during the dusk and dawn periods. And so if we look at when they're traveling farthest away from the nest over the course of the night, you see it peaks for rural males here in the dusk and dawn period. And urban males have a similar pattern, but what's different for them is they tend to be less active right after dusk and shift this activity to later in the night. If we look at, so we looked at when these owls are making these movements, but if we look at the period of time during the night when all these movements occur, so they're not just moving at dawn and dusk, they're moving over the course of the night. If we look at their nighttime hunting window, what we see is that urban males in yellow and rural males in green have different foraging periods. So rural males have a longer foraging period at night, or longer potential foraging period, than urban males do. Let's see if this one, sweet. So ranch males tend to travel farther away from their nests at night, and there's more variation among individuals in these movements when we compare them to urban owls. And urban owls also shorten this nighttime movement window and shift it to later in the night. So the question becomes, what's driving these patterns and differences? And so I'm going to start with urban males. So part of my research looks at how development within the urban landscape, specifically within the city of Cape Coral, influences space use and resource selection for provisioning male burrowing owls. And so within this landscape, it's pretty monotonous, but there is variation, and that's driven by the percentage of residential lots that have been developed or built into a house or park typically. And so what we have in Cape Coral is actually this sort of development gradient. So in the southwest here, it's more green, which means more of the lots have been developed. And as you move northwest, most of the land is vacant and hasn't been developed. So we have this gradient in residential development, and we have owls and GPS data across this gradient. And so in terms of burrow site selection, unlike Western burrowing owls, Florida burrowing owls are actually able to dig their own burrows, so they can choose where they're placing them in the landscape. And in terms of this burrow site selection, what we find is that urban owls show a preference for placing their burrows on vacant land. So lots that don't have houses or just vacant areas in general. However, we also find that contrary to this, as the proportion of lots that have been developed, so as the proportion that have been built on and have a house on them increases, you actually find more owls in a given area. So even though as development increases, they're losing their preferred nesting sites, you actually find more owls where you have more houses. And additionally, when we look at how much space they're using, as development increases, these males are actually using less space when they're hunting at night. So as development increases, you find more owls and they're using less space, even though they're losing their preferred burrowing habitat. And when we look at the individual GPS points for these owls, so where specifically are they over the course of the night, we find that males are showing selection for yards over vacant parcels, which suggests that they're visiting these locations specifically. So even though they have this preference for nesting on vacant lots, the availability of this developed land, like this yard here, seems to be driving their nocturnal movement patterns and the placement of their burrows by providing potential resources for them. And so there's a lot of variables that development like this changes in the landscape. There's light at night, there's irrigation, you have structure from plants and buildings, among other things. And all of these factors really can be influencing the abundance or availability of their prey, which remember, a lot of time are these non-native vertebrates, like Cuban tree frogs you might see on the side of your house. And we didn't, unfortunately, measure any of these, and they all warrant further investigation. So zooming out to Florida as a whole, the red areas in this map are baseline urbanization. So the red areas are areas that are urbanized as of 2010, and over here we have what's projected in 2070. So as development intensifies in cities, vacant lots and open land is going to become more scarce. And so even though burrowing owls respond positively in some ways to this development, we don't know if they're going to be able to persist as vacant land disappears entirely in the future. And so this uncertainty about the future of these urban populations means that these understudied ranch populations, including those on cattle, especially those on cattle ranches, are increasingly important. So additionally, what you can see is red areas are projected to increase in the center of the state, which is where we find these rural ranch owl populations. So it's also important that we document and study these populations, because as these former pastures might be converted to other agricultural or urban development, we might be undercutting the viability of this species in the state. And so now focusing a little bit more on my ranch study sites, I had 5 ranches again that I worked on. And across 4 of these ranches, I have GPS data for 25 male burrowing owls. One site, unfortunately, Archibald Preserve, never produced any juveniles during my study, so I don't have any reproductive GPS data for them. And so most ranches aren't just rectangles of flat bahia grass. Instead, they're mosaics of all sorts of different habitats and landscapes. And this includes the short grass that burrowing owls really like, but it also includes, for example, a lot of wetlands on a lot of ranches. And so within these wetlands, there's a lot of potential prey species for burrowing owls. For example, I see a lot of crayfish claws and a lot of frog legs at burrows on ranches. And so I began to wonder if these wetlands represent really important resources for burrowing owls that are breeding on ranches, even though that they like that higher ground for their nests. And so this is an analysis in progress. And here I'm just going to be showing you some results from the GPS data from one site, Buck Island Ranch, where I had GPS data for 7 males across 2 years. And what I have in this picture here are the nest burrow locations for 3 of these GPS males. And in this picture, all of these points are their overnight GPS locations across 2 weeks while they had young they were feeding. And so the purple and green and orange are all different males and where they went at night. And I wanted to know if they're utilizing these seasonal wetlands when they're hunting at night. And these are shown here in blue. And what I'm finding is that some of these males do show a preference for visiting these habitats at night in the same way that the urban males show a preference for visiting people's yards. And so additionally, I found that the farther a GPS location is from a burrow, so that's the x-axis here, the more likely a male is to be in or around one of these wetlands. And so what this means is that males are willing to expend energy and travel farther away from their nests in order to visit these areas. And so again, in urban areas, the presence of development and developed lots with houses and parks appears to be driving burrowing owl space use and movements, as well as owl density. And so on ranches, for some males, wetlands are a resource they're visiting at night while they have owlets, and it might be driving some of their movements as well. So when they're raising and feeding their young, burrowing owls on ranches are visiting wetlands, and the presence of these habitat features is potentially driving some of the variation we see from individual to individual in the distances that they're traveling from their nests. But again, this is a work in progress. And also, burrowing owls don't just need hunting grounds. Of course, they need dry ground to nest on, because as they nest underground, wet ground and flooding can cause nests to fail. And if we want to look at reproductive success across all of my ranch sites in 2017 and 2018, this graph shows the number of pairs on each ranch, and in black, that means they fledged at least 1 juvenile. Medium gray means they had an unknown fate, and light gray means they did not fledge anything. And so as far as reproductive success and the number of breeding pairs, there's a lot of variation among these ranch sites, and we're only just scratching the surface as far as what contributes to this variation. And we've also observed over the past few years, this is again 2017 and 2018, that burrows frequently flood during the breeding season. And so again, these are all the all the ranch sites and the number of territories that experienced flooding that year on the x-axis. And so you can see that there is a lot of flooding, but it varies a lot site to site and year to year. So in 2017, it was a drier year until June, and we only saw flooding at one site. But in 2018, when we had heavy rains in May, we saw extensive flooding across all of these sites. So if I got the data from the GPS unit, it means they made it back, because these are pretty small owls. And so the GPS I used only stored data. They didn't transmit it to a satellite or a cell phone. So I actually had to recapture them to get it back. I'll finish answering before I go on. And so there were some males that disappeared over the course of the GPS study, but every male we had data for survived that period and fledged young, or that kind of thing. So yeah, but sometimes they do. There is mortality during the breeding season, but usually like 90% of the adults are going to survive a breeding season. So flooding. So Florida floods. And so burrowing owls definitely evolved in a landscape where they were exposed to flooding annually. However, despite this long-term exposure for them evolutionarily, flooding can lead to reproductive failure. And so, for example, when a burrow floods, the young are going to be forced to the entrance. And when that happens, they're exposed to both predation and also exposure from the elements. And so, not surprisingly, the age of the owlets when a burrow flood is going to have a really big impact on whether or not they survive the flooding event. And so that's what this graph shows. So we have brood age in weeks on the bottom here. And as this line goes up, it means that their probability of surviving that flooding event increases. And so if the owlets are less than 3 weeks old, they're pretty much guaranteed not to make it through a flooding event. But if they're more than 4 weeks old, most of them survive. And this is probably for a couple reasons. First, the older owls are more mobile, so they can follow their parents to higher ground or to an alternative burrow. And also they have better feathering, so they can thermoregulate better, so the heat and potential cold is not going to impact them as strongly. And so this is important because even though burrowing owls do regularly experience flooding, if it occurs earlier in the breeding season when we have more eggs and younger nestlings, it can cause major reproductive failure. And we did actually observe this at one of our sites in 2016, as this unfortunate 2-week-old nestling who's been flooded out of his burrow can attest to. And so in spring 2016, it was following an unusually wet winter that ruined everyone's field work. And we also ended up getting heavy rains in May. And what happened is at one of our sites, pretty much every burrow flooded. And when they did, a lot of the younger broods and egg clutches were lost. However, at another one of our sites, it experienced the same level of flooding at the landscape scale. But you can see in 2016, this is breeding seasons here on the bottom and how high or what the elevation of the nest rows are on average. So we had a really wet winter leading to that. And so at this site, the adults were able to place their burrows on higher ground going into the breeding season. So when we got those heavy spring rains, they didn't experience the same flooding and brood loss. And we found that in later years that were drier, they actually moved lower down. So they may have a preference for lower ground unless it's a wet year. And so I only have partial reproductive data for 2016. So the inferences I can make from here are limited. But earlier flooding overall can be a problem for burrowing owls. And within the ranch landscape, the availability of higher ground can be beneficial, both to provide alternative nesting sites or refuge for young owls when their burrows flood. And so overall, burrowing owls on ranches, what I found is that wetlands are potentially a really important source of resources for them when they're breeding on these ranch landscapes. But again, I'm still working on that analysis. Additionally, the presence of slightly elevated ground can help flood displaced juveniles and families. And so overall, I think there are two really general take-homes when it comes to burrowing owls on Florida ranches so far. And the first is that this may sound really obvious, but urban and rural burrowing owls are different. And what I mean by different is that their behavior differs and their interactions with the landscape around them differ. And so therefore, we can't necessarily treat them as this monolith for conservation. And along this line, we're currently working on a genetic comparison of individuals from urban and rural sites. And the point of this is to determine if these really are separate populations of owls, where owls that are born on ranches tend not to move to cities and vice versa. Or if it's one large population where an owl born on a ranch can move to a city. And that'll give us a lot more information on how we need to manage this species going forward. And so another important message is that even though there's a lot of variation in density and reproductive success across our cattle ranch sites, these ranches provide really important habitat for burrowing owls and other wildlife species. And this is especially true as Florida continues to urbanize. And so accordingly, I think research like what we've been doing, but more in depth into the factors that are allowing burrowing owls and other species to be successful in these landscapes is going to be really important going forward. Yeah, so burrowing owls fail for a lot of reasons. They might get predated, their burrow might collapse, that kind of thing. And so they will re-nest. They typically tend to re-nest if it's earlier in the season. So if their burrow floods in June, they're probably out of luck. But if something happens in, say, April or even early May, you might get another nesting attempt. Let's see. I don't know if I have. Yeah, I can't think of any examples of them using the same burrow after it floods to try a new nesting attempt in that breeding season, but I also have limited re-nesting attempts after flooding. So the question is, what natural predators do the burrowing owls have? Quite a few. So for adults, I've seen predation from birds of prey, like harriers that are migrating through. And it's hard to say what has eaten an owl when you find a partially eaten owl. But so birds of prey, especially accipiters, like a Cooper's hawk is one. And for the nests, spotted skunks, I've found predated nests that smell like skunks before. An opossum will predate a nest, a coyote will predate a nest. And that's mostly on ranches. In urban areas, the biggest thing there's cats are a problem. And Cooper's hawks are a problem. What is interesting, we don't see a lot of nest predation in the urban sites. We do have non-native reptiles like tegus, like large monitor lizards that will use burrows. And I've actually never seen one in a burrow or never seen evidence of them predating them, but yeah. They will. So in the countryside, there's limited overlap in their habitat type with gopher tortoises. Gopher tortoises are more in those upland and scrub habitats, but there is an interface with some pastures where you have some gopher tortoise burrows. And I have seen burrowing owls using old gopher tortoise burrows, but that does happen too in the urban sites where there are gopher tortoises in Cape Coral and Marco Island. So yeah, they will use gopher tortoise burrows, but they're mostly digging their own. Oh yeah. I didn't include a video because I had enough technical troubles as it was, so that probably would have crashed the whole system. So I'm glad I didn't. But yeah, they grab. I can show you a video. Andrew, I can't seem to pull up the online questions if there's any. Oh nope, I did it. Oh hi, Raoul. So the question is, can I explain a little bit about their among-year site fidelity? So how likely are the same owls to be in the same site and potentially the same burrow year to year? It's higher in urban areas. About 90% of the owls that were banded in one site one year were there the next year or found nearby the next year. And for ranches, it varies a lot. Some ranches were as low as about 40% and others were as high as 80 or more percent. And I didn't present that because I'm working on the data because my detection rates are very different for urban and rural sites. So that's a complicating factor. Anything else on that? Yes and no. So yes and yes. The question is, do they mate for life or do they switch up their partners year to year? So I have seen burrowing owls that have been paired for basically the entirety of my study repeatedly. So they will mate for life. But also divorce is a common occurrence too. And if one mate dies, the other mate will often quickly replace that mate. So I don't know what environmental factors cause them to split up. It could be potentially after a nest failure or any number of reasons, but they will mate. They're kind of like humans. They might stay together forever, but they might switch it up midway. And in case I didn't repeat that question, it was, do they mate for life? Yes, there are varying numbers of pairs in the pastures here. I did try to catch them and ban them one year. It never worked. And there's usually only, I think, 1 or 2 pairs here. So I didn't include those in my study, but they are here sometimes. So yeah, they are here at the REC in the cattle pastures. So one of my urban sites doesn't really have any gradients in it. It's Marco Island, and it's pretty heavily built out. And so I'm including it, but I'm mostly focused on Cape Coral, where there's like a really strong gradient in urbanization across that city. Okay, I'm going to do some of the online questions. Betsy Boughton wants to know, is flooding the main cause of variation in fledging among cattle ranches? And do I ever see variation due to ranch activities like grazing or fire? So to the first part of that question, when it comes to flooding, unless you have an unusual event where a ranch floods early, like we had at that one ranch in 2016, flooding actually doesn't seem to be related to their overall productivity. So that one ranch I showed you a picture of that had a really high density of owls, that ranch floods like crazy, and it's also our most productive site. So flooding in and of itself doesn't seem to be what's driving that variation in productivity right now. And variation due to ranch activities like grazing or fire. So I haven't looked at grazing specifically in terms of burrowing owls, but they do like short grass areas. And short of having fire on the landscape, you're going to need grazing to keep that short grass. So having cattle on the landscape, I think, is extremely important for burrowing owls. But as far as the intensity of grazing, I haven't done any work on that. And as far as fire, I think I have anecdotally, there's been fires at a couple of my sites, and I haven't seen any negative impact or abandonment of territories because of early season fires. And another question from Betsy is, what is the impact of the high density populations? Is there less weight gained by fledglings or any negative effects of highly dense populations? And so, no, is kind of the short answer there. What I found is that there's no relationship at all between local owl density and either reproductive success rate or the number of juveniles that owls fledge, so productivity. So that doesn't seem to be, there's no negative density dependent impacts there. Okay, so this person, Juan Oteza, I'm sorry, I butchered your name. Does any data exist on female movement in rural areas? If you had to speculate, what do you think foraging movement patterns would be? And would they be similar between the sexes? Thank you. So I don't have data on females. I chose males specifically, well, for a couple of reasons. So there's been some comparative work in the western subspecies of burrowing owls, and what they found is that during this nestling period, when I put the GPS on males, the males are the ones who are primarily responsible for making these longer trips away from the burrow and responsible for bringing back these really important energy-rich vertebrate prey species like frogs or rodents or whatever they're eating at that site. And so I chose males because I wanted to capture that. Like, I wanted to see what areas they're going to get those high value prey items. And additionally, during this nestling period, at least for the first 2 weeks, the females are mostly brooding the young, so they're not leaving. They will, during the day, opportunistically bring insects back locally. But across the whole nestling period, and especially in that early nestling period, the females tend to stay closer to the burrow, and they're bringing back smaller prey items locally. So I would expect in this case for it to be quite similar. I would expect them to during the early nestling period to be staying closer to the nest and bringing back different types of prey. They could also be making these long trips, but I don't know because I had limited manpower and GPS capabilities. I wanted to minimize variation among my study individuals. So that's why I left females out this time. And I also didn't want to disturb them when they were brooding their eggs. So I have a question from Vivian Handy, and she wants to know if I have seen issues with cattle trampling or damaging burrows. So it does happen. I've never seen, let me say, a cow breaking its leg because it stepped in a burrow and collapsed it. I think that's mostly a myth, but the burrows do often get collapsed by cattle, but it's really not catastrophic unless the bird is very unlucky and the cow happens to crush the nest chamber, which remember is often deeper underground. The parents will just dig a new tunnel out and continue on with business as usual. So it does happen, but I don't think it has a major impact on the burrowing owls besides a temporary inconvenience. And so Michelle Van Deventer wants to know that the maps I had didn't include sea level rise, the map I showed that projected future urbanization. And she wants to know, are rural versus urban sufficiently different that urban coastal populations could adapt to rural habitats? And so that's something we don't know yet. So first, sea level rise is probably going to be a big issue for these coastal populations in these cities that are marginally above sea level already. So it's likely that they will have some displacement going forward. But as far as whether or not urban owls can adapt to ranch sites, it's possible, we don't know. So we know that they have altered behavior, they have slightly different prey items, and they're foraging in different types of habitats. But what we don't know is whether or not an owl that's born in a city is going to be able to go and be successful on a ranch. I suspect that they would be able to, but that's part of what our genetic work is going to look at, determine if we do have movement among habitat types. James Keltner would like to know, given that there are high populations of green iguanas in Cape Coral, have I observed any relationship between the two? Honestly, I've never seen an iguana in Cape Coral, and it's possible that larger iguanas could dig out burrows and potentially eat eggs, but I don't know that iguanas would do that. I do know that burrowing owls will eat small iguanas though, so they will actually use young iguanas as a prey source. And Andrew Tyler wants to know, talking about the relationship between precipitation and nest elevation, if elevation is a function of inches of rain the preceding summer and winter. In other words, do they dig new sites at lower elevations following a drier winter? And so one slide I showed that showed elevation at one site after a wet year, then 2 drier years. They were at lower elevations in the drier years, but I don't know if they're doing that because it's drier or if they have a preference for those sort of medium elevations. I suspect they don't want to be at the absolute highest point. They want to be somewhere in the middle. They want to be high enough where they can see and be dry, but not at the absolute highest point in the landscape unless they have to be because it's flooded. But I haven't really done much analyses with that, no. And Craig Fallhaber wants to know if there are any creative habitat management techniques that could be tried to increase owl density or reproductive success on ranches. And so, like I said, I'm only really just scratching the surface for what's important for burrowing owls on ranches. I do think, though, that maintaining variety in the landscape, and this has been shown with Western burrowing owls, they hunt in a variety of different habitats. So I think having variety, including wetlands or maintaining wetlands, or maintaining ditches, which is another source of these potential aquatic prey items, might be important for burrowing owls on ranches. But I haven't done sort of a wide-scale comparison to figure out the factors that are really driving reproductive success on ranches. So Vivian Handy also asked if I think the installation of artificial burrows would entice increased populations on suitable ranchland habitats. I don't know. I know for the Western burrowing owls, artificial burrows are a really important conservation tool because of the persecution of burrowing mammals out there and the loss of prairie dog colonies, for example. And the Western burrowing owls are really dependent on using the burrows of other animals. But in Florida, they're able to dig their own burrows. I think you might be able to they will use artificial burrows in Florida for sure. In Southeast Florida, they use them pretty extensively. I think it's a good way to maybe entice owls to a certain part of a property if you're trying to do that, but we don't have any information on ranches if those would be helpful or not here in Florida. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you so much.